During the 7 years of abundance, Joseph traveled throughout Egypt, overseeing the collection and storage of grain in areas where grain was produced. Huge quantities of grain were stored, likened to the sands of the sea. Joseph stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Before the famine years came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, the daughter of Pharaoh. She had been given to Joseph by Pharaoh when he appointed Joseph to be in charge of all the lands of Egypt. When the famine years came, just as Joseph had said, famine spread throughout all the other lands, but food was available in the whole land of Egypt. When all Egypt began to feel the famine and needed food, Pharaoh told them to go to Joseph, who would tell them what to do. Joseph opened the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians. Other countries, unprepared, had to come to Egypt to buy grain. Back in Canaan, Jacob learned there was grain in Egypt. Genesis 42. So he sent 10 of Joseph's brothers to buy grain in Egypt, but he didn't send Benjamin, because he didn't want harm to come to him. Since Joseph was the governor of the land, his brothers had to get Joseph's approval and were taken to him. They bowed their faces to the ground before Joseph. Joseph recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger. He remembered his dreams and treated them suspiciously in order to see how they would react. They told him they were all brothers and had only left their father and a youngest brother in Canaan. They added that one brother lived no more, referring to Joseph. He accused them of being spies. They tried to persuade him that they were honest men, but he told them he would test them. Joseph instructed that they must send one of them to get their youngest brother to prove their honesty. He kept them all in custody for 3 days. Then Joseph told them, since he feared God, only one brother would be required to stay in prison while the others took grain to their starving household. But he demanded that they bring the younger brother back, or they would be put to death. The brothers spoke with one another, feeling they were being punished for selling Joseph. They remembered Joseph, pleaded for his life, but they didn't listen. Joseph understood what they were saying, but because he used an interpreter, they didn't understand him. He turned away and began to weep, but then turned back to them and had Simeon bound before their eyes. Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain and put the silver used for purchasing the grain back in each man's bag. He also gave them provisions for their journey. When they arrived back in Canaan, they spoke with their father Jacob and told him all that had happened. Since they were treated as spies, they had to take Benjamin back to get Simeon released and prove their innocence. But Jacob refused to let Benjamin go, because he felt certain both Simeon and Benjamin would be held captive. Now the severe famine continued in the land, and Jacob's family had eaten all the grain, according to Genesis 43. Jacob instructed his sons to go back to buy more food, but Judah told him that they were warned solemnly by the governor not to come unless they had their youngest brother with them. Jacob finally relented, but insisted that they take some of the best products of the land as gifts. Those gifts included balm and honey, spices and myrrh, pistachio nuts and almonds. He told them to take double the money they had found in their sacks and to go with the Almighty God's mercy that they might come back. So all the brothers left with the gifts, silver and Benjamin, and hurried to Egypt and presented themselves before Joseph. When Joseph saw Benjamin, he instructed the steward of the house to take these men to his house, slaughter an animal, and prepare dinner at noon for all of them. Now Joseph's brothers were afraid when taken to his house. They believed Joseph would attack them and take them all as slaves for not having returned the silver that had been previously put in their bags. So they told Joseph's stewards about the silver they found in their bags on the first trip, and that they were returning it and also had silver for more grain purchases. But the steward said to them not to be afraid, because the God of your fathers has given treasure to your bags. The steward received silver for their purchases. When Joseph came home at noon, his brothers presented gifts to him and bowed down to the ground before him. He asked about their father, and they said he was still living, and they bowed low to pay him honor. As Joseph looked about, he saw Benjamin, his own mother's son. Joseph was deeply moved and hurried out to a private room where he wept. Once Joseph regained his composure, he came out and ordered the food to be served. They served Joseph by himself, the brothers by themselves, and the Egyptians by themselves, because it was detestable for Egyptians to eat with Hebrews. The brothers were seated in the order of their ages, from firstborn to youngest. The brothers were astonished when Benjamin was served from Joseph's table. He was given portions 5 times more than theirs, so they feasted and drank freely with him. Later, when they were preparing to go back to Canaan, Joseph had the steward put each man's silver in the mouth of his bag of grain, and in Benjamin's bag he also put Joseph's silver cup. Genesis 44. When they left on their way back to Canaan, Joseph told his steward to go after them immediately, and when you catch them, ask, "Why have you repaid good with evil? Isn't this the cup of silver that my master drinks from and also uses for divination?" He checked all the bags and found the cup in Benjamin's bag. The brothers tried to persuade the steward that they hadn't stolen it, but all were returned to Joseph. When Joseph's brothers entered, he asked them why they had done such a thing. Judah said they would all be slaves to Joseph, and Judah pleaded with Joseph concerning his father Jacob, and that his father would not live if his only remaining son from his beloved wife, the son Benjamin, did not return as feared. Judah pleaded for Benjamin to be sent back, and he would be Joseph's slave in return. Joseph could contain himself no longer and revealed his true identity to them in Genesis 45. The brothers were terrified of Joseph, but he had them come close to him, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt." But he told them not to be angry or distressed with themselves, because he was sent ahead to prepare for them and all the things that God had done for him. He said they would live in the land of Goshen, and they would all be near Joseph, family, flocks, herds, all that they had. He wept with Benjamin and all his brothers, and when the news reached Pharaoh's palace and all of his officials, all were pleased. Pharaoh said he would give the best land in Egypt, provide carts for the journey, and promised to give them the best of all of Egypt when they returned. When the brothers arrived in Canaan, they told Jacob all that had happened, and that Joseph was alive and the ruler of all of Egypt. So Israel set out with all that he had, according to Genesis 46 and 47. He sacrificed at Beersheba to the God of his father Isaac. God spoke to Israel at night in a vision and said, "Jacob, Jacob, I am God, the God of your fathers. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make into you a great nation. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back, and Joseph's own hand will close your eyes." So Jacob left Beersheba with all of his sons, wives, and children in their carts that Pharaoh had provided, as well as livestock and possessions he had acquired. The members of Jacob's family numbered 70. Joseph met them when they arrived in Goshen, and Jacob and his son wept together. When Pharaoh met with Jacob and learned that they were shepherds, he gave them the best parts of Goshen in the district of Ramses. Pharaoh also said that if any of his family had special ability, to put them in charge of his own livestock. As the famine progressed, and all of the Egyptians had given all the money they had for grain, Joseph made them exchange livestock for grain. Joseph gave them grain for food in exchange for horses, sheep, and goats, cattle, and donkeys. With the rapidly increasing population of livestock given to Pharaoh for grain, Jacob's family provided a very important service, caring for large and growing numbers of livestock in Egypt, according to Genesis 47. As Jacob neared death, he brought his sons together and said he would tell them what happened to them in the days to come. When addressing Judah, he said, "Your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. You are a lion's cub, O Judah. You return from the prey, my son. Like a lion he crouches and lies down. Like a lioness, who dares to rouse him? The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he comes to whom it belongs, and the obedience of nations is his. He will tether his donkey to a vine, his colt to the choicest branch. He will wash his garments in wine, his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes will be darker than wine, his teeth whiter than milk." This was considered to be a prophecy relating to the Messiah to come, Jesus of Nazareth. When Jacob died, he was taken back to the land of Canaan in a great procession and buried in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, where Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and Leah were buried. In the following years, Joseph stayed in Egypt along with his father's family. He lived 110 years, and as he came near to the end of his days, he told his brothers, "Surely God will come to your aid, and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Joseph made the sons of Israel swear on oath that after God had come to their aid and taken them to Canaan, that they would carry his bones up from this place to the land that they were promised. Joseph died and was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt, according to Genesis 50. Now Joseph and his brothers of all that generation died, but God made the Israelites fruitful, multiplied them greatly, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. 400 years later, a new Egyptian king came to power who did not know or recognize Joseph. With the Israelites becoming so numerous, he reasoned they may join an enemy, fight against the Egyptians, and leave the country. So he oppressed the Israelites with forced labor. But the more they were oppressed, the more the Israelites multiplied and spread. It is estimated that there were about 2 million men, women, and children at that time, so the Egyptians came to dread them and deal with them even more ruthlessly.
This chart shows the likely route that Joseph's family took when leaving Canaan and traveling to the land of Goshen in Egypt. The land in Egypt was very productive, especially for shepherding flocks and cattle. It also was an area of Egypt where the Hebrews could easily separate from the other peoples of Egypt. This was important because the Egyptians looked down on the shepherds and did not associate with them.
Concerned with the rapid growth of the nation of Israel, the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, told the Hebrew midwives Shiphrah and Puah to kill the newborn babies if they were boys. The midwives feared God, so they let the boys live. When asked by Pharaoh why they did not kill them, they answered that the Hebrew women were vigorous and gave birth before they arrived, unlike the Egyptian women. So God was kind to the midwives, and the Hebrew population continued to grow. Pharaoh then issued the order that every Hebrew boy born was to be killed, but every Hebrew girl could live. A man of Levi and his wife had a son born to them. She hid him for 3 months, and when she could no longer hide him, she put him in a papyrus basket coated with tar and pitch, and put him among the reeds along the Nile River. His sister watched the basket to see what would happen. This baby was named Moses. Pharaoh's daughter was bathing in the river, and she and her attendants were walking along the river bank. She saw the basket and sent her slave girl to get it. When she opened it, the baby was crying. She felt sorry for him. She knew it had to be one of the Hebrew babies. The baby's sister, who had been watching, asked Pharaoh's daughter if she needed a Hebrew woman to nurse the baby. And Pharaoh's daughter said, "Yes, go." The girl went and got the baby's mother, and she nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter and became his son. Pharaoh's daughter named him Moses, for she said, "I drew him out of the water." After Moses grew up, he witnessed an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Thinking no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. The next day, he saw 2 Hebrew men fighting and asked one of them what was wrong. "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you going to kill me as you did the Egyptian?" When Moses heard this, he knew his deed had been found out. When Pharaoh heard about what had happened, he wanted to kill Moses. But Moses fled to Midian. In Midian, Moses helped the daughters of Reuel, who were watering their flocks, and shepherds had come and driven them away. But the daughters arrived back early because of Moses' help, and they told their father about the Egyptian who helped them. Reuel invited Moses to eat and stay with him. After Moses agreed, Reuel gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage, and Moses worked as a shepherd. During the next 40 years, the king of Egypt died, and the Israelites cried out because of their slavery. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and was concerned about them. One day, while Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, he led the flock to Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw the bush aflame, yet it did not burn. Moses approached the bush, and God called to him from within the bush, saying, "Moses, Moses." Moses replied, "Here I am." God told him not to come any closer, but to take off his sandals, for the place he was standing was holy ground. God said, "I am the God of his father, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Moses was frightened to look at God and hid his face. God had heard the misery of his people in Egypt, had heard their cries because of their slave drivers, was concerned about their suffering. So God said he had come to rescue them from the Egyptians and bring them to a land flowing with milk and honey, the land of Canaan. And God said, "I am sending you, Moses, to Pharaoh to bring back my people out of Egypt." Moses said, "Well, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" "I will be with you," God told him. As proof, they would worship God on this mountain, the Mount Horeb, when the people came out of Egypt. But Moses said, "What shall I say if the people ask me the name of the God of their fathers?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am. Tell them I am has sent you." God also said that the Lord of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation. God instructed Moses to go to the elders of Israel and tell them what God had told him, and that God had seen what had been done to them in Egypt and would bring them out of their misery. God told Moses the elders would listen. Moses and the elders were to go to Pharaoh and tell him that the Lord God of the Hebrews had met with them, and they wanted to take a 3-day journey to the desert to offer sacrifices to the Lord their God. But God warned them that the king of Egypt would not let them go unless a mighty hand compelled him. Therefore God stretched out his hand to strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that he would do. Then Pharaoh would finally let them go. So when Moses and the elders left, God said he would make the people favorably disposed to the Israelites, so they wouldn't leave empty-handed. They were instructed for every woman to ask her neighbor and any women living in her house for articles of silver, gold, and clothing to put on their sons and daughters. They would plunder the Egyptians. In the event the Egyptians did not believe Moses, Moses was to throw his staff on the ground and it would become a serpent. When he picked it up by its tail, it would turn back into a staff. God also had Moses put his hand inside of his cloak, and when he took it out, it was leprous. When Moses put his hand back in his cloak and took it out, it was restored like the flesh of his body. They didn't believe the first miraculous sign or the second, and still would not listen. Moses was to take some water from the Nile and pour it out on dry ground. The Nile water would become blood on the ground. Moses was afraid. He wanted God to send someone else. He complained that he was not eloquent of speech. He was slow. "Now go. I will speak and teach you what to say." But Moses still wanted God to send someone else. God's anger burned against Moses. But according to God, Aaron, Moses' brother, will speak for Moses, and God would tell Aaron what to say. Finally, Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and told him he wanted to go back to his people in Egypt. Jethro told him to go and wished him well. God had revealed to Moses that all the men of Egypt who wanted to kill him were now dead. So Moses took his wife and sons on a donkey back to Egypt. On the way, God told Moses to go to the desert and meet Aaron. They met at the mountain of God, and Moses told Aaron everything God had told him. Once in Egypt, Moses and Aaron brought together all the elders of Israel, told them everything that God had told Moses. They also performed the signs before the people, and they believed. Moses was 80 years old at this time. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the desert." Exodus chapter 5. Pharaoh answered that he didn't know their God and would not obey him. He then accused Moses and Aaron of trying to take the people away from their labor. Pharaoh imposed harsher conditions, requiring the people to gather the straw for their bricks and not reduce their quota of the bricks they were to make. The people were unable to produce the quota with these conditions, so the Egyptians beat them and derided them as being lazy. The Egyptians wouldn't listen to Moses and Aaron about going and sacrificing to the Lord, and that began to affect the Israelite foremen. They complained to Moses and Aaron that they had made the people a stench to Pharaoh and his officials and put a sword in their hand to kill them, because the people were scattering over all of Egypt to find straw. Moses appealed to God about the trouble brought upon his people, and God said, "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh." Exodus 6. He told Moses to tell the people that he had established a covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to give them the land of Canaan, and he had heard about their groaning and remembered his covenant. God said to tell the Israelites, "I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God." God said that he will make Moses like a god to Pharaoh, and Aaron will be his prophet. Exodus chapter 7. From this time on, Moses, as God's messenger, performs a series of miraculous signs and wonders as separate events over several weeks. Each time, Moses pleads with Pharaoh to let God's people go. After each miraculous event, Pharaoh's response is unyielding and his heart becomes harder. Then Moses pronounces the next miraculous event upon Pharaoh and his people. These take place in Exodus chapters 7 to 12. Initially, God has Aaron throw his staff to the ground and it becomes a snake, but Pharaoh's wise men, sorcerers, and magicians could duplicate the feat with their secret arts. However, Aaron's staff swallowed up all the other staffs. God tells Moses on 10 other occasions what to do to initiate another miraculous event. These miraculous events or plagues were, first, the plague of blood, where all the waters of Egypt were changed into blood. The Nile River, the streams and canals, ponds and reservoirs, even water in wooden buckets and stone jars. Number 2, the plague of the frogs, where frogs covered the entire land, the Nile, in the palace bedrooms and on beds, into the officials' houses and on the people. Number 3, the plague of gnats, where all the dust of the ground of Egypt became gnats and were upon all men and animals. Number 4, the plague of flies, where dense swarms of flies poured into Pharaoh's palace, houses of his officials, and throughout Egypt the land was ruined by flies, except for the land of Goshen, where God's people were. Number 5, the plague on livestock, where the livestock in the fields of the Egyptians died, the horses, the donkeys, the camels, the sheep, and goats. No, one of the animals of the Israelites died. Number 6, the plague of boils. When Moses threw handfuls of soot into a furnace, it became like fine dust over all Egypt, and festering boils broke out on all men and animals. Number 7, the plague of hail. God sent the worst hailstorm ever to fall on the Egyptians, and all the livestock and men not under shelter, and everything growing in the field and trees were stripped and beaten upon. The only place it didn't hail was the land of Goshen. Number 8, the plague of locusts, when God made an east wind blow all day and all night across the land, and locusts were brought in that invaded everything. The ground was covered until it was black. They devoured everything that was left after the hail in the fields, on the trees and in the plants. Number 9, the plague of darkness. Total darkness covered all of Egypt for 3 days. This was a darkness that could be felt. No one could see anyone else or leave his place for 3 days. Yet all the Israelites had light in all the places where they lived. But the final and 10th plague was the Passover. Since Pharaoh had still refused to let Israel go, God had hardened his heart as before. And Moses told Pharaoh about midnight that the Lord will go throughout all the land of Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the firstborn son of a slave girl who is at her handmill, and all of the firstborn of the cattle as well. There will be a loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than has ever been or ever will be again. But among the Israelites, not a dog will bark at a man or an animal. Then you will know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. God also said that Pharaoh would not listen, so that God's wonders could be multiplied in Egypt. The Lord said to Moses that this month is to be the first month of your new year. Tell all Israel on the 10th day of this month for each man to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they're to share it with their neighbor. Exodus chapter 12. The animals were to be 1-year-old males without defect. And then on the 14th day of the month, the whole community must slaughter them at twilight. Some of the blood must be put on the tops and sides of the door frames of the houses where the lamb would be eaten. The meat would be roasted over a fire, head, legs, and inner parts, and to be eaten with bread made without yeast. None should be left until morning. If any was left, it was to be burned. Special instructions were given how to eat it. Your cloak tucked into your belt, the sandals on your feet, staff in your hand. And on that night the Lord will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, men and animals, and bring judgment on Egypt. The blood of their doorpost was a sign. God would pass over them, and they would not be stricken by the plague. They were to commemorate this day for generations to come and celebrate it as a festival to the Lord. After other instructions, Moses told them to select their animals. With hyssop, put blood on the doorpost, and eat this Passover meal. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from Pharaoh's house to slaves and prisoners and livestock as well. A loud wail went up from Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you've requested. Take your flocks and herds, as you said, and go. Just bless me." The Egyptian people also urged them to hurry and leave. So the Hebrew people took their dough before the yeast was added, and carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs wrapped in cloth. They also asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Egyptians were made favorably disposed by God, and they gave the people all they asked for. So they plundered the Egyptians that day. Exodus chapter 12. The Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, and there were about 600,000 men on foot besides women and children. That probably was about 2.5 to 3 million people in all. Many other people went up with them, as well as large droves of cattle, both flocks and herds. The length of the time the Israelites lived in Egypt was 430 years to the very day. The Lord kept vigil over them all night and brought them out of Egypt. They were told to keep this vigil this night in honor to the Lord for the generations to come. God gave them instructions on how to prepare and celebrate the day when they came out of Egypt, and consecrate the firstborn, and to tell their sons that on this day the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, and the Lord killed the firstborn of the Pharaoh and all the Egyptians. And this is why we sacrifice to the Lord the first male offspring born of every womb, and redeem each of the firstborn sons. God led the people by the desert road toward the Red Sea, and the Israelites were armed for battle. Moses took with them the bones of Joseph, because he had made the sons of Israel swear an oath. Exodus 13. After leaving Succoth, they encamped at Etham, on the edge of the desert. By day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud, and at night by a pillar of fire to give them light. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of light at night left its place in front of the people. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Turn back and encamp near Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. Encamp by the sea, directly across from Baal-Zephon, on the Saudi Arabian side of the Red Sea. The Egyptians will think that the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, but I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them." Exodus 14. Pharaoh and his officials changed their mind when Israel left Egypt and said, "What have we done? We've lost all of our Israelite services." So Pharaoh had his chariot made ready, and 600 of the best chariots, as well as others with officials all over them. The Egyptians with all their chariots and horses pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the Red Sea at Pi-hahiroth. The Israelites trembled when they saw the Egyptians marching after them. Moses told them not to be afraid, to stand still, and see what God would do for them. Moses was told to raise his staff and stretch his hand out over the sea and to divide the waters so the Israelites could go through on dry ground. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned the ground into dry land. In the meantime, the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. With this protection, the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. Then the Egyptians pursued and followed them into the sea. The Lord threw the Egyptian army into confusion. The wheels of the chariots came off, and the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites, because God is fighting for them." However, God told Moses to stretch out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place and covered the entire army of Pharaoh. Not one of them survived. When the Israelites saw the great power of the Lord displayed that day, the people feared and put their trust in God and his servant Moses. In celebration of this great happening, Moses and the Israelites sang a song to the Lord, Exodus 15. And Miriam, Aaron's sister, led the women with tambourines in hand and dancing and singing to praise the Lord. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went along the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled into the desert without finding water. When they came to a place called Marah, the only water found was bitter, and the people grumbled against Moses. The Lord told Moses to throw a piece of wood provided into the water. The water became sweet, and God made a decree and law with them and tested them. He said, "If you listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God, will you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." Then they went to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees. They camped there near the water. The Israelite community then traveled to the desert of Sin, halfway between Elim and Sinai. They then grumbled because of the lack of food, so God gave them quail to eat in the evening, and bread in the morning, something that they called manna. From the desert of Sin they traveled to Rephidim, but there was no water there. People again grumbled against Moses. So God took Moses to the rock at Horeb and had him strike it with a staff, and water came forth. The Amalekite people also attacked the Israelites here. And Joshua led the army of the people to fight against them. All the while, Moses was holding up his hands on the hill. When he held up his hands toward God, the Israelites prevailed. So Aaron and Hur helped hold his hands up until sunset, when Joshua overcame the Amalekites. Exodus 16 and 17. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law and priest of Midian, came to see Moses. When Jethro saw the burdensome work Moses was doing in settling disputes and being judge for the people, Jethro told him to set up an organization made of capable men to help. Moses was to teach the men who were to help with the decrees and the laws God gave them. Moses would be the people's representative to God, but they would appoint officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens, men who feared God, trustworthy, and hated dishonest gain. In the 3rd month after Israel left Egypt, on the very day, they came to the desert of Sinai and camped at the base of Mount Sinai. In Lesson 2, we'll start looking at the happenings at Mount Sinai and a new law for God's people. In the beginning of our study, we started with the first book of the Old Testament, Genesis. We saw the events of creation and the creation of man and woman by God. God prepared a perfect place for them to live, the Garden of Eden. They were to care for the garden and not to eat of the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. One of the creatures God made, the serpent, posing as Satan, tempted Eve to eat of the fruit, and she also gave the fruit to Adam to eat. Because of this disobedience, God cursed them and sent them out of the garden, where life was more difficult, and they had to live in a world that now knew sin. Before they were sent out of the garden, God made a promise looking to the future that the woman's seed would crush the head of the serpent, and the serpent would strike the heel of her offspring. We haven't yet seen the full intent of this promise so far in our study. Outside the garden, life became very difficult for Adam and Eve. The first son, Cain, killed his brother Abel, the younger son, because Abel's sacrifice was more pleasing to God. It was also difficult to make a living from the soil, and childbirth was difficult for the women. With the knowledge of evil, subsequent generations became more wicked until all their thoughts were only on evil. God grieved that he had made mankind and made plans to wipe mankind from the earth. God did find a righteous man, Noah, and he and his family built an ark according to God's instructions to prepare for a flood. The waters came from above and from within the earth, and Noah and his wife, his 3 sons and their wives, along with the animals they loaded on the ark, were saved from the flood. God made a covenant as a rainbow to testify that he would never again destroy mankind and the earth by flood. They were on the ark for a year before the waters receded enough for all to disembark. Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, settled in different areas with their wives, and through their genealogies we know the parts of the world they settled. Shem is the father of the Jews and other Semitic peoples. Ham is the father of dark-skinned peoples of the African continent, and Japheth is the father of the Gentiles or Caucasian races. We have come from one of these men. Some generations later, Abraham, a descendant of Shem, is given a promise by God to journey to the land of Canaan, for it would be given to him and to his seed, and that through his seed all the nations of the earth would be blessed. This same promise is also made to his son Isaac, and then later to Isaac's son Jacob. Jacob is named Israel by God and becomes the father of the Israelite nation. The promise relates to the first promise made in the garden, but will be clearer as we progress our study. Joseph, Jacob's first son by birth to his wife Rachel, is sold because of hatred by his 10 brothers to Midianite merchants, who carry him to Egypt, where he works as a slave to Potiphar. Joseph, while working faithfully for Potiphar, is put in prison because Potiphar's wife falsely accuses Joseph of trying to sleep with her. Joseph, with God's help, interprets dreams of a cupbearer and baker which come true. Eventually, the cupbearer remembers what Joseph did, and Pharaoh calls on Joseph to interpret 2 dreams he had. Again, Joseph, by God's revealing, tells Pharaoh that the famine is imminent, and Egypt must prepare for it. Pharaoh makes Joseph second in command only to himself, and is in charge of a grain storage program. All Egypt comes to Joseph for food, including his brothers in Canaan. They eventually find out Joseph is their brother, repent of their betrayal, and bring the entire family to Egypt, where they are shepherds for their flocks and herds, as well as those belonging to Pharaoh. When Jacob is dying, he tells all of his 12 sons what's going to happen, and he tells Judah the promise of nations being blessed through their seed would come through him, through Judah. 400 years would pass. The Egyptians would enslave the tribes of Israel, making bricks. God sends Moses as his messenger. Following 10 plagues God sent upon the stubborn Pharaoh in Egypt, Pharaoh allows the nation of Israel to leave. Israel's population was 600,000 men by this time. They leave Egypt as the nation of Israel under the leadership of Moses and Aaron, and by God's direction traveled to the Red Sea. Pharaoh and his army follow them, and when God makes the sea part and enables the nation of Israel to cross the Red Sea on dry land, Pharaoh and his armies follow the same route and are killed by the seas, returning and covering the dry land route God created. Not one Egyptian survived. All of the time we studied to this point has occurred under the patriarchal period or dispensation, where God spoke to the fathers of families as He chose. Priests were appointed by God, and they were aware of how to make sacrifices to please God, but the details of how this occurred are not revealed in Scripture for the period. The New Testament refers to this period in Hebrews 1 and verse 1, where it says, God spoke to the fathers. It was principally viewed as a family religion, where each family, as led by God, were to do His will with a good conscience. In the patriarchal period, when God wanted something done, He spoke to the heads of the families, like Adam, Noah, or Abraham. In concluding Lesson 1, there are major events that occurred during the patriarchal period when God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and in various ways to man. The timeline for some of the events is not known, and some others can be derived through following genealogies throughout the Scriptures. Some of the time periods for specific events are identified in Scripture, such as the flood. Total time Adam and Eve were in the garden and then cast out of the garden. Considered the fall of man. The flood and through the Babel period cannot be derived with certainty. However, there are genealogies in the Bible that give some idea, but not confirmed by scholars universally. Biblical timelines usually began with the patriarchs starting at Genesis 12, somewhere around 2250 BC, because early world history recorded about the dynasties of those periods conformed to one another. Much independent study of these major events, such as the flood or location of the exact crossing route of the Red Sea, continued today. Several efforts have occurred to confirm the exact location of the ark, thought by many to be on Mount Ararat in Turkey. The period of time from when the promise was given to Abraham until the patriarchal period came to an end with the giving of the law of Moses is thought to be about 800 years, which ended at 446 BC. Preceding Abraham's time, the flood occurred with mankind starting over again, and all that occurred in and out of the garden. After the flood, we saw the incident at the Tower of Babel, where the building was stopped by God and languages were confused. The events of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph are fascinating because they advance the promise for mankind. We saw Jacob's family move to Egypt, grow into a large nation known as Israel, and then find freedom from their bondage by the Egyptians with Moses as their leader. We ended this lesson with the nation of Israel camped at the foot of Mount Sinai, and Moses going to the top of the mountain to receive a new law.